By now, everyone knows the story of the hobbit in his home under a hill, who journeys with his companions to free Middle-earth from the grasp of the Dark Lord Sauron. But elsewhere, in a country at the bottom of the world, in a quiet village in a house by the sea, a young boy, fittingly born on Halloween, would dream of leaving the comforts of home to fulfill his own destiny, not to face down terrifying monsters, but to create them. This is not the story of Frodo and his quest to destroy the One Ring, but of a humble man named Peter Jackson, and his journey from making the goriest splatter films the world has ever seen, to creating the greatest fantasy epic ever put to screen. Peter grew up as an only child, but he was far from sheltered, often playing with his next-door neighbor, throwing makeshift spears at each other and setting up camp in the rolling hills of Pukerua, the perfect environment for his imagination to roam free. From the beginning of his filmmaking career, storytelling and special effects went hand in hand, both being inseparable elements that define Peter Jackson's films. Before he had any aspirations to direct, Peter Jackson had an immense passion for prosthetics and special effects, and first dreamt of becoming a special effects artist and stop-motion animator. Peter was exposed early on to the fantastical world of stop-motion and animatronics by way of the works of Ray Harryhausen, 1933's King Kong, and magazines like Fangoria and Famous Monsters of Filmland. This would prove to be an obsession that extended far beyond the realm of childhood fascination, with Jackson going on to direct an adaptation of King Kong in 2005, and helping to found Weta Workshop, one of today's modern legends of special and visual effects. One of his earliest experiments was making a cat disappear into a puff of smoke by chopping up film frames, and finding a way to replicate bullet holes by piercing the film to let the projector light shine through. He later made his first model creature, which he described as a crazy hunchbacked rat, which would later become the inspiration behind the Sumatran rat monkey in his zombie film, Braindead. He was also a huge fan of Monty Python, their trademark skits of farcical comedy and cartoonish violence shaping his adolescent sense of humor, which was considered to be obscene in conservative New Zealand. Jackson began shooting his very first film at the age of 9, a wartime movie set in the trenches of World War I called The Dwarf Patrol. He made the short together with his neighborhood friends in his hometown of Pukerua Bay, going so far as to borrow some barbed wire from a local farm to add to the realism. From a young age, he had a special interest in wartime history, his family having migrated from England, sharing stories of having lived through both world wars, which he would later revisit with his 2018 World War I documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. Peter Jackson later became acquainted with school friend Ken Hammond, and the two immediately bonded over their shared grotesque love for splatter and special effects. While attending school in Kapiti, he would find himself working on amateur films with his friends on the weekends, one such film being The Valley, utilizing much of his stop-motion know-how he had gathered thus far in the film. The fantastical plot follows the doomed fate of two prospectors who fall into a space-time continuum where they fight off a horde of inhuman creatures and, mimicking the iconic ending of the Planet of the Apes, discover that they'd traveled to a future ruled by monsters. He submitted The Valley to the local Spot On Film Festival, and though he failed to nab the top prize, he received his first recognition in the local paper. Shortly after, he took on his first real job in the photo department at the Evening Post. He continued shooting around the Kapiti coast with his friends Ken and Ian for a film under the working title of Curse of the Gravewalker. Taking inspiration from B-movie hammer flicks like Captain Kronos' Vampire Hunter, Jackson took on the starring role as Captain Umig, a crazed vampire killer hunting bloodsuckers in the Carpathian Mountains, tracking down his arch-nemesis Count Murnau, a nod to F.W. Murnau, director of 1922's Nosferatu, Although it was never finished, it gave Jackson a crucial opportunity to develop more sophisticated prosthetic effects for his future movies. At the age of 21, Peter Jackson took a trip with Ken Hammond to Los Angeles, which turned out to be a movie-making pilgrimage, visiting Universal Studios and Hollywood Boulevard, and attending local horror and sci-fi conventions. This lit a fire that inspired him to start shooting his first feature, making the transition from the Super 8 short films of his youth to the 16mm film that had begun to take over the silver screen, drawn in most of all by the alluring opportunity to make a profit from his work. His cast and crew consisted of his old friends Peter O'Hearn and Ken Hammond, as well as Mike Minette and Terry Potter, his workmates from the newspaper photo department. Terry later brought on his friend Dean Lowry, and the group quickly became fast friends. The idea started off with a character of Giles, played by Ken's former workmate Craig Smith, a social worker collecting famine relief in a rural New Zealand town, before being kidnapped by a family of cannibals. Most of it was shot around Jackson's hometown of Pukerua Bay, with the main house set in a historic homestead in Porirua. The story is set in the fictional town of Kaihoro, which in Maori translates to eat greedily. The local town of Makara was set as the basis for the abandoned village, which immediately caused problems for the crew, as the police arrived just hours after they began shooting, after a passing motorist saw Jackson and crew putting up a fake road sign leading to Kaihoro. The project felt more like a fun weekend activity than shooting for a film, and at the end of each Sunday, they came up with more ideas of new gags to shoot next, leading to the shoot extending indefinitely and the story developing into something else entirely. Eventually, the crazed cannibals transformed into flesh-eating aliens, and the film grew from survival horror into an all-out action comedy bloodbath. Although initially beginning as a casual project that they initially believed would wrap in 6 weeks, little did they know it would snowball into a giant production costing $25,000 and over 4 years to produce. Originally titled Roast of the Day, Ken Hammond came up with the name Bad Taste, after Jackson included the element of the aliens harvesting humans for their fast food chain. Though Jackson had yet to come up with a term, Bad Taste gave birth to the genre of splatstick, combining equal parts gore and comedy. Despite the gruesome gags, Jackson's sincerity and childlike glee for movie making showed that there was substance behind the splatter, the budding filmmaker demonstrating his creativity, ingenuity, and resourcefulness in patching his Frankenstein film together in service to the story. Jackson came up with most of the special effects himself, from the prosthetics to the replica firearms, which he made out of aluminum, wood, and polymer clay, looking almost indistinguishable from the real thing. His parents remained supportive throughout the process, transporting the boys between locations and providing craft services, with Peter's mother even loaning out her oven to bake the alien masks in.
I'd have a menu planned for the meal that night, using the oven, and quite often we'd have to end up by having sausages or something under the grill because he'd want the oven for his baking. He used the oven a lot, and the whole kitchen actually used to take over to make his moulds.
Jackson also tried to include an uncooperative sheep into a recurring role, but it only ended up as a cameo in the finished film, where it gets blown up in the end by a rocket launcher. As the production dragged on, Jackson faced the biggest problem all first-time filmmakers face: an ever-dwindling lack of funding. It was at this point that he turned to the New Zealand Film Commission, or the NZFC for short, to secure additional funds to complete the seemingly endless production. He was initially turned down several times, until Jackson sent them a letter with his latest 75-minute cut of the film. This impressed producer Jim Booth, who had initially been the one to reject Jackson's previous pleas, and he decided to take a chance on young Peter's film. In October of 1986, Jackson received $235,000 in funding from the Film Commission, and he quit his job for the Evening Post to work on his film full-time. Jackson tried to fit in with the commission's incentive to make the film more marketable to a wider audience, as the film's offensive subject matter might prove to be too much for squeamish Kiwi moviegoers. Despite this, Peter decided to leave in a scene where one of the members had to eat vomit out of a bowl, encouraged by veteran filmmaker Tony Hiles, who had stepped in to help the young director, having been quoted as saying, "If you don't do it now, you'll never get another chance."
Christ, you'll never believe what I just had to do. Did you have to drink some chuck?
Jackson's feature film debut was unsurprisingly met with dread and disgust, but was also hailed as a masterclass in horror and black comedy, much to the director's delight.
I mean, I'm definitely not a violent person myself. I'd never want to, never want to experience half the stuff that goes on in Bad Taste.
A little movie made in the suburbs of an island country at the bottom of the world found its way at the top of the screenings at Cannes, winning the festival prize for the best gore film, and quickly headed to be the fastest-selling movie in New Zealand history. Despite this, Bad Taste still struggled to find an audience on its home court, though it amassed a cult following upon its release on video. The splatter wouldn't stop there, however, as the train on a trail of blood and guts was going full steam ahead, with no end in sight. In April of 1989, Peter Jackson began brainstorming an idea for a new movie. Deep in the twisted maze of his mind, he envisioned the grisly scene of a full-on puppet massacre. The only problem left was writing a story to get there. It was during the production of Meet the Feebles that Peter Jackson first met Fran Walsh, who would later become his lifelong partner. Walsh was working in the industry developing scripts for television, although she initially found her calling as a member of a punk band called the Wall Sockets. At the time, Walsh was together with writer and playwright Stephen Sinclair, who helped develop the script. They were introduced to Jackson by their mutual friend Jamie Selkirk, who had worked on Bad Taste, and Sinclair and Walsh were invited to watch an early cut. After their initial meeting, Sinclair called up Jackson with a movie idea that would later be the basis for their next film, Braindead. They initially planned to shoot Braindead as soon as they had finished the script, but a lack of funding for their big idea forced them to set their sights on another project while hunting down investors. Jackson came up with the idea for Meet the Feebles while working on Bad Taste with Cameron Chittock, who had helped develop the prosthetics and puppetry. He developed the story together with Walsh and Sinclair, while Chittock worked on the creatures. Jackson wanted to do something outlandish and perverse without the use of real actors, eventually settling on a twisted parody of The Muppets. But instead of a cheerful cast of puppets teaching valuable life lessons, he wanted to feature a gang of morally bankrupt degenerates who embodied everything that was wrong with society.
Now that's what I call an impartial journalist.
Meet the Feebles was originally developed as a television series, but once again, the pilot was too outlandish and scandalous for his native New Zealand, and was immediately shot down. While trying to secure funding at a film market in Milan, he was scouted by a Japanese film company who saw 7 minutes of edited footage, and they instantly decided to help fund the project, under the clause that the project should instead be developed as a movie. 1989 was a slump year for the New Zealand Film Commission, but with a bit of luck, enthusiasm, and perseverance, they managed to secure an additional $500,000 for Meet the Feebles, giving Jackson a pivotal opportunity to bounce back and advance his filmmaking career, which was in danger of ending before it had barely even begun. At this point, Jackson and crew had to develop a 24-minute script into a full feature film. The script had barely been developed, much less for a full-length film, and they only had 3 weeks before principal photography to meet their investors' deadlines. This placed a great deal of pressure on the writing team to come up with a working story while simultaneously shooting, but also meant greater creative freedom to deliver what they wanted on screen, without being tied down by rewrites or notes from the producers, one of the few benefits that came with being an independent film. The production of Meet the Feebles was a symphony of blood bags, smoke machines, chemical fumes, and the endless cacophony of machine gun fire. Despite being a film starring nearly an entirely animatronic cast, the complexity of puppeteering meant that they were more often than not behind schedule. According to Jackson, every single shot in the movie was a special effect. Jackson describes the process of filming The Feebles as follows. We had this incredible job of making a naturalistic drama using non-humans. I had to use a lot of shots and camera movements to cover it up. It's something that gives the movie a rhythm and a tempo which goes towards giving it a little life, where no life exists. The production was every bit as uncomfortable and disgusting as the script, being equal parts absurd dream and waking nightmare. Shot in the middle of winter, the crew had to work underneath the floorboards of the abandoned rail shed that served as their set to move the animatronics. This was only the beginning of their problems, as the rat-infested shed hosted a serious flea problem, forcing the crew to wear rubbish bags on their legs and dog flea spray in their hair. Freezing, itchy, and exhausted, the crew worked over 12 hours a day to meet the tight deadline, but powered through the shoot thanks to the surreal and outrageous script, which kept them laughing through the stress and pressure.
Neat leg, you man-stealing slut!
With the film commission breathing down their necks, some of the crew pooled together their money to fund an additional week of shooting in secret. Beating all the odds, Meet the Feebles finally released to the public in 1990, the same year that Muppets creator Jim Henson passed away, with some of the crew joking that it was due to the shock of seeing the movie. While international reception to the film was met with more amusement than disgust, it was received with controversy and backlash back home in New Zealand, where it was even barred from entry in the annual Wellington Film Festival. Members of the New Zealand Film Commission expected this to be the end of the director's career. But on the contrary, Jackson was approached with several job offers in the United States, even being offered a directing job from Disney executives. It was at this time he met Mark Ordesky, who reviewed scripts for New Line Cinema, which would be a fortuitous calling card down the road. He was later contacted by New Line founder and CEO Robert Shea, who asked him to write a script for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but the deal came to a dead end when the script was scrapped. As predicted, Meet the Feebles was warmly received in Japan, with Jackson getting to visit the country on an all-expenses-paid fantasy film festival tour. The box office reception started strong, but ended up being a flop, only grossing $80,000 out of their $750,000 budget. And though it also garnered a cult following, it failed to create as much of an impact as Bad Taste. However, Jackson was undeterred, stating the following in an interview: "If people come out of this film dazed and shell-shocked, that's great. I've got people to take puppets seriously, which I think is a big joke. I might possibly not make another film in my life that's as original." Jim Booth echoed the sentiment, saying, "There would probably be no other film like it in the world." Reception to Meet the Feebles was divisive, with some praising its originality and crass humor, while others saw it as an offensive, nauseating assault on moral values and basic human decency. Fran Walsh defended the film, saying, "I feel like it's a really brave film in that it's bold and uncompromising. It wasn't at all geared to the market, but I think with a film of that type, it probably shouldn't have been. It really was new territory for everybody. Nobody knew what kind of effect 90 minutes of puppets would have on somebody's brain." Heidi the Hippo, played by co-writer Danny Mulleron, would later go on to be nominated for the Best Female Performance at New Zealand's 1990 Film and Television Awards, and winning the same award at Rome's Fanta Festival. Following Meet the Feebles, Jackson and Walsh excitedly returned to finish working on the script for Braindead. Between finding funds, preparing the script, and working on production for Meet the Feebles, pre-production took more than 2 years to get off the ground. But in contrast to The Feebles, Jackson had a polished script to stand on top of, after meticulous rewrites shared between the team of Jackson, Walsh, and Sinclair. The trio's magnum opus originated from an idea from Stephen Sinclair about a man who transforms into a monster trapped within the confines of suburbia. The story evolved into an inversion of the classic zombie story, when the timid Lionel Cosgrove, played by Timothy Balm, has to bear the responsibility of caring for his zombified mother, later playing caretaker and jailer for a full family of zombies in his basement until all hell literally breaks loose. Although it began as tongue-in-cheek commentary on suburban paranoia, Jackson knew from the beginning the movie had to close with a climactic bloodbath. Fran Walsh recalls the writing process, having once stated, "The movie was a bit like The Feebles. We always planned it with carnage at the end. Peter's chief interest in the stories originally was that there was going to be lots of room for blood bags and severed heads." Finally, in 1991, after months of workshopping at Sinclair's flat above a Chinese restaurant, the film began to lurch to its knees. After Bad Taste's silver screen debut at Cannes, Spanish producers saw the film and expressed a desire to finance the production for Braindead, with the caveat that the female leading role be played by a Spanish actress. This is how Diana Peñalver came into the lead role of Paquita, whom Jackson met after seeing her performance in a play while in London. Though the Spanish producers later withdrew their support for the project, the writing team grew fond of Peñalver's character and decided to keep her on board. Jim Booth stepped in once again to finance the film, and Jackson's Japanese investors likewise returned to support his works of gleeful gore. At the time that Jackson began his directorial journey, there were no special effects companies in New Zealand due to a lack of demand, but due to the rushing tide of projects coming his way, Jackson realized he could no longer do all the jobs on his own, bringing on board Cameron Chittock, Richard Taylor, and Bob McCarran for the special effects, who would later become instrumental to the founding of Weta Workshop. Though combining the genres of slapstick comedy and over-the-top violence was, at this point, the director's signature, Jackson officially came up with the term splatstick while working on Braindead. According to Jackson, "This isn't violence. This is splatstick. It's totally different. The more gross you are, the more harmless it becomes. Because you go so totally over the top that people will have to laugh. They can't possibly believe it. That is really the key point. The only harmful violence is believable violence. Realistic violence. And there's nothing in this film that's realistic at all. Laughter and horror, I think, are very close. You can be horrified one moment, but then given the slightest opportunity, that can quickly turn into laughter when you realize how ridiculous it is." Shooting in Avalon Studios Lot 11, every room of the Cosgrove house was an individual set, built so the crew could shoot in each section simultaneously, using a menagerie of movie magic tricks to bring the scenes to life. The sweet scent of maple syrup was a constant on set, the special effects crew utilizing more than 40 gallons of maple syrup blood during the production of the movie, using a high-pressure hydraulic hose to spray as much viscera as they needed, often coating the actors and occasionally the crew from head to toe. Holes were cut out in the bottom of the set's floorboards for crew members to move around under, and soak up any excess blood that seeped in through the cracks. Director of photography Murray Milne shared his experience working on the set of Braindead. "We were absolutely covered in this gunk afterwards. They had big 44-gallon drums underneath to catch the stuff and recycle it. All the sugar started to ferment after 3 or 4 days. I think at one stage they ended up having to run heaps of disinfectant through it all, because of fears as to what might be breeding." The director also shared a similar view, saying, "No one complained, but it was so uncomfortable. Your feet would stick to the floor like in a bad cinema." One of the prosthetic zombie heads was later stolen while they were shooting a scene at Karori Cemetery. though a local woman found it among her teenage son's possessions and promptly returned it. A local man later saw a photo in the local paper about the Braindead crew shooting right next to the headstones of his extended family. Seeing this as a desecration of his family's graves, he took the matter to court, demanding that any footage containing the graves be cut from the film, and that all screenings of Braindead be put on hold until his case could be properly argued. At the time, Jackson and crew were all set to head out to Cannes to promote the film, and wouldn't be able to have their premiere screening if the injunction went through. The judge understood the situation and gave them the go-ahead, under the condition that screenings in New Zealand had to be put on hold until the case was properly convened. Braindead was met with equal parts revulsion and applause, to this day often being cited as one of the goriest movies of all time, with one review arguing that Braindead out-zombified all previous zombie flicks.
I kick ass for the Lord!
Tim Baum won the award for Best Actor, while Richard Taylor won Best Special Effects at Rome's Fanta Festival, where it was presided by special effects master Carlo Rambaldi. Over in America, Braindead became caught in a bidding war between film production companies, with Trimark ultimately coming out on top to secure exclusive distribution rights. In turn, Trimark respected Jackson's wish to release the movie uncensored and uncut to American audiences. One thing they did have to change, however, was the title, as it was found to be too similar to American director Frank Henenlotter's film Brain Damage, and later on to a much more obvious degree with Bill Paxton's film, which shared the exact same name. Other titles such as Housebound, Unstoppable Rot, Cranial Blowout, and Bubonic Basement were considered, but Trimark ultimately settled on Dead Alive, as it is still known today to many international audiences, though much to Jackson's chagrin. Surprisingly, despite the surrounding controversies, Jackson finally received praise and recognition from his home country, with Braindead screening in Kiwi theaters for over 4 months and winning several awards at the New Zealand Film and Television Awards, bagging the prestigious prizes for Best Film, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Male Actor. Though Jackson was elated to finally receive some much-deserved praise from his fellow Kiwis, he had no time to sit on his laurels. Another idea soon began to stir his imagination, featuring creatures of a different kind, spinning his darkest tale yet, that of the friendship between 2 teenage girls. Heavenly Creatures is a film based on the real-life New Zealand murder case of Honora Parker, who was stoned to death by her daughter Pauline Parker and Pauline's best friend and accomplice, Juliet Hume. The most speculated motive behind the murder was their forced separation. Hume and her family were to return to England, and Pauline's mother forbade her to go with them. The girls escaped the death penalty due to them being minors, and after both serving a 5-year prison sentence, Juliet Hume returned to England, while Pauline Parker remained in New Zealand on probation. They were both given new identities and were released under the condition that the two never meet again. The story behind the relationship between the 2 girls and the fantastical worlds that they shared between letters to each other both captivated and horrified the imaginations of the conservative island nation. Though many interpretations and even more moral lessons were woven from their bond and the murder that tied them together, Peter Jackson found his own way of telling their story, and along the way, shaped a new identity for himself as a filmmaker, balancing the fine line between fantasy and reality. Looking for a break from monsters and gore, the story of Hume and Parker's case seemed like the perfect change of pace, with Walsh and Jackson starting work on the script for Heavenly Creatures in 1991, shortly before beginning production on Braindead, motivated by the idea of a murder story which had no villains. By this time, Jackson had earned a reputation for making juvenile exploitation flicks, and many doubted his ability to tackle such a sensitive and real topic. On the contrary, however, Jackson's approach to the case was more sympathetic than others at the time, as many were quick to paint the pair in a bad light, while the director found himself sympathizing with them on a personal level. The two girls' escapist fantasies struck a chord with the director, who related through his childhood days spent living out the adventures of his inner world and making friends through a love of sharing stories. Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh did extensive research into Hume and Parker's lives, interviewing former students and friends, and reading through their publicly released diary entries, the film taking its name from a line in one of Pauline's poems, "The ones I worship."
'Tis indeed a miracle one must feel, that two such heavenly creatures are real. Both sets of eyes, though different far, hold many mysteries strange. Impassively, they watch the race of man decay and change.
Fortunately, they found funding from German producer Hanno Huth, who had seen Braindead and was eager to finance Jackson's next project. The casting proved to be instrumental to the film's success, as choosing the right actresses for the leading roles could either make or break the film. Jackson flew to London to cast the role of Juliet Hume, and made the acquaintance of a budding stage actress by the name of Kate Winslet. Although this would be her first on-screen debut, Jackson was impressed by the intensity she brought to her audition. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Fran Walsh discovered high school student Melanie Linsky, who, despite having limited acting experience, had an unexplainable on-screen presence that drew in the filmmakers during her audition. Linsky and Winslet faced the immense challenge of carrying a story that held a lot of weight not just on screen, but in real life as well. The two girls held a striking resemblance to the characters they were portraying, both actresses also coming from England and New Zealand. And as the pair grew close on set, they found their relationship mirroring that of their on-screen counterparts, developing a sympathy for their roles that helped to truly bring authentic emotion to their performances. Kate Winslet had this to say about her connection to Juliet Hume. "If I had something to say to her, I would say, I just want you to know that I really do feel so much for what you went through, and I don't want you to feel that I've dug up your past. I'm sorry if this film being made does hurt you, but I hope it's been done with no offense meant. I think I'd like to meet her, really, and tell her that myself." Jackson took great lengths to shoot on the actual locations, including the Hume's original homestead at Elam, the girls' school campus, and the scene of the crime at Victoria Park. In contrast to Jackson's previous film outings, the production of Heavenly Creatures was a more somber affair, especially when it came to the moment when they had to shoot the pivotal murder scene. Kate Winslet accurately recalls the events that took place just before the camera started rolling. "We just stood there when we got there and basically freaked out, crying and going, 'Why did they do it?' Peter walked down to me, hugging me and quietly crying himself. We all just sat there for about half an hour on this track like lost, devastated souls, sobbing. I think that says enough about who he is, that he's not just a guy who directs splatter films." The unexpected tonal shift of Heavenly Creatures turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as it had become Jackson's most acclaimed work yet, earning him both critical praise and box office success worldwide, flipping Jackson's reputation on its head almost overnight, turning him from New Zealand's notorious splatter artist to the country's most respected filmmaker. Jackson would later go on to write and direct the movie Forgotten Silver alongside veteran Kiwi filmmaker Costa Botes, who had met Jackson during the production of Bad Taste, and even had a cameo as an alien who gets run over by a car. The film chronicles the historical account of Kiwi filmmaker Colin Mackenzie, who is credited as being the inventor of many modern cinematic achievements, such as the close-up shot, as well as sound and color film. The twist, however, was that it was actually an elaborate hoax, chronicling the life of a completely fictional character, honing Jackson's ability as a filmmaker to spin a convincing lie to seem like a believable truth. Cinematographer Alan Bollinger took extra measures to make the film seem old and dated, such as slowing the shutter speed, deliberately filming some scenes out of focus, and even coating the processed film in oil. Jackson enlisted the help of Miramax and journalists to help conceal the lie, releasing fake interviews with the fictional characters, and falsely claimed to have enjoyed researching Colin Mackenzie's life. Those not in on the joke were completely taken in by the hoax, with many media outlets and film and television executives putting to print Coda's and Jackson's film as historical fact. A local New Zealand museum even phoned the director, asking to borrow Mackenzie's old film equipment to set up as part of an exhibit. When the truth finally came to light, the idea of their fake documentary was met with mixed reception, some praising the filmmakers' ingenuity, with others responding with confusion and outrage, claiming that they had done irreparable damage to the credibility of documentaries. Reviews went from hailing the film as the best New Zealand entertainment in 10 years, while another critic ranted that Jackson and his conspirators should be shot. Costa Botes defended their stance on the mockumentary, stating, "To my mind, a hoax is something you keep up, and we never had any intention of never coming clean. We thought the next day it would all come out, and it's actually come out with very little help from us." Though the revelation dissolved the pride of many Kiwis who wanted to believe in Mackenzie's fictional accomplishments, Jackson ended up playing the role of iconic filmmaker for his home country, representing New Zealand's filmmaking ingenuity on the international stage. The success of the computer effects used in Heavenly Creatures opened the door to bring Cotes and Jackson's grand vision of historical events and epic battles to life. Richard Taylor, who had first worked with Jackson on Meet the Feebles and had been responsible for creating all the practical and visual effects on Braindead alongside Bob McCarran, first started using computer-generated effects in Heavenly Creatures with the help of George Port. While Jackson and Taylor were used to working with stop motion and prosthetics, newly released movies like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park heralded in a new age of digital movie magic, with companies like George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic showing the endless new possibilities that digital effects could conjure. In an interview with Cinefex, Peter Jackson shared his enthusiasm for the future of filmmaking, saying, "When I saw the computer-generated T-Rex in Jurassic Park, I felt as if I was 12 years old again. I had feelings of awe and wonder watching that movie that I hadn't had since I was a kid watching the original King Kong." The team of Peter Jackson, Jim Booth, Jamie Selkirk, George Port, Richard Taylor, and his wife, Tanya Roger, invested in the necessary computer equipment needed to set up their new company, founding Weta FX in 1993.
I've done 4 films now which have all involved effects, and every time we've made a film, we've assembled a team of people together to do just that movie, and when that movie finishes, they go off and do other things. And then when I come up with the next film, we have to get them together again, which is okay, but it's not a particularly efficient way of working. So we just sat down and decided that we would form a company.
The name Weta was derived as an acronym for Wingnut Effects and Technical Illusions, and also as a nod to the monstrous cricket-like insects native to New Zealand, an apt choice for the creatures that they would be churning out for the big screen. Weta Workshop would be responsible for bringing Jackson's wildest visual dreams onto the silver screen, and would also provide effects for other films and television series set in New Zealand, such as Jack Brown Genius, Hercules, and Xena the Warrior Princess. However, a bigger challenge loomed on the horizon to test out Weta's newfound expertise, Jackson's first ever Hollywood film, The Frighteners. Sometime during the production of Heavenly Creatures, Walsh and Jackson began developing a new story titled The Frighteners, a comedy horror revolving around a psychic conman who wrangles ghosts to scam people into exorcising them, until a spectral serial killer threatens to end both the living and dead alike. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, Robert Zemeckis, Richard Donner, and Joel Silver were looking to develop scripts for a Tales from the Crypt movie anthology. Jackson's agent in LA forwarded his script for The Frighteners to Zemeckis, and though The Frighteners didn't quite fit the bill for Tales from the Crypt, Zemeckis was hooked by the story and asked Jackson if he wanted to direct the project himself, while stepping in to be the executive producer. Zemeckis decided to help Jackson get his big Hollywood break as a way of paying it forward the same way Steven Spielberg did for him many years before. Though Jackson was thrilled to get his foot in the door to Hollywood, he still set things on his own terms, on his home turf. Universal agreed to have the film shot in New Zealand, as long as they were able to convincingly make the film look like it was set in the American Midwest. Zemeckis recommended Michael J. Fox for the leading role after having starred in his hit blockbuster Back to the Future. Fox had some reservations after reading the script, but after watching Heavenly Creatures, Fox went up to Jackson, saying, "I think you're a twisted, genius bastard. If you want me to take the boat, then I want to go." Trini Alvarado, who played leading lady Lucy Linsky, shared similar praise working with Jackson, saying, "It was like heaven. You couldn't get me to say a bad word about it." Much of the cast enjoyed working on set for the Frighteners, both impressed and touched by Jackson's passionate approach to directing, and even got the rare opportunity to provide their own input and ideas into the script.
Asshole.
As usual for Jackson, he was working on multiple projects at the same time, still shooting additional scenes for Forgotten Silver just a week before principal photography began on The Frighteners. Weta was similarly swamped with a backload of effects work, while tackling some of their most intricate work yet on the new film, working on around 40 full effects, both digital and practical. Handling the challenge of shooting a film where half of the characters are ghosts ended up being one of the most ambitious digital effects work done for a blockbuster at the time. Weta needed more computers and manpower than they ever had before, and had to resort to bringing in digital artists from Hollywood to help manage the crunch times, enlisting the help of ILM's Wes Takahashi, who had done the effects for the Back to the Future films. Takahashi was impressed by the ability of Weta's effects team, pleasantly surprised that New Zealand had raised the standards of digital effects alongside ILM. Production on The Frighteners went on for nearly 130 days, one of the longest studio shoots that Universal had ever produced. Back in New Zealand, Jackson's influence had finally won over the support of his fellow Kiwis, with local publicity hailing the movie as the country's biggest film to date. The director went on a tour to promote the film overseas, joking that it was a New Zealander's failed attempt at an American movie, and all the better for it. Although The Frighteners suffered a poor box office premiere due to competing with Rowan Emmerich's sci-fi blockbuster Independence Day on the same weekend, the film made more money in its opening week in the US than any other film directed by a New Zealander in the country's entire history. Although the movie was received with mixed reviews, The Frighteners not only put New Zealand on the map, but took the horror genre to new heights, casting its spectral shadow on Hollywood and beyond for years to come. Following the success of The Frighteners, Universal offered Jackson the chance to write a remake for Kong. Jackson was initially reluctant to take on the project, but realized that no one else loved the film as much as he did, and felt he had to take on the responsibility to do his favorite movie justice. However, development on the movie stalled, and it would be many years until he could finally make his childhood dream a reality. After 2 years of non-stop work, Jackson and crew found themselves at a lull in their career. Following the massive undertaking of The Frighteners, he had to try to make use of his now idle digital effects team, whose resources and manpower had to be put to use if they wanted to stay afloat. Peter and Fran spent the next few months thinking of a project that could possibly set a new bar for their special effects team, and settled on developing a fantasy epic the likes of which had never been seen before. Jackson first tried to adapt his script Blubberhead, which he had written 6 years ago during the filming of Meet the Feebles, which he describes as a cross between Monty Python and Lord of the Rings. But as the pair continued developing the script, they found themselves drawing more and more comparisons to Tolkien's legendary trilogy, until they realized, why not go straight to the source? Until that point, Jackson never even imagined the possibility of adapting Tolkien's seemingly untouchable work sharing his feelings in an interview. "I wasn't at the place where I had a lifelong ambition to make a film of The Lord of the Rings. I'd read the book once and really liked it, but I felt it would be out of my reach. You just naturally assume that it's an impossibility." Interestingly, Jackson first discovered Lord of the Rings not through Tolkien's novels, but from Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film, which later inspired him to pick up the books after seeing the movie. Bakshi was a man after his own heart, famous for his similarly scandalous animated films such as Fritz the Cat and Coonskin, sharing Peter's perverse sense of humor and love for animation that dared to explore mature themes. Bakshi thought the best way to capture Tolkien's fantastical world was through animation, which he achieved with a fusion of traditional animation and rotoscoping. Although due to production issues, the film only adapted until the end of the second book. The Lord of the Rings has been notoriously difficult to adapt into film, on one hand because of the massive scale and depth of the novels, and the Tolkien estate's fickle nature with filmmakers adapting his work. In November 1995, Fran and Peter approached Harvey Weinstein at Miramax with the possibility of developing The Lord of the Rings into a feature film. Tolkien had first sold the rights to film production company United Artists, who later passed the torch to American film producer Saul Zaentz, who also helped to secure the rights for Bakshi's animated adaptation. Weinstein had previously helped Zaentz on producing The English Patient and decided to call in a favor. The deal was originally planned to adapt The Hobbit first, followed by a two-part Lord of the Rings duology. Zaentz, after meeting with Walsh and Jackson, and seeing their passion and knowledge for the project, gave his blessing along with the rights to the Tolkien legacy, and in April 1997, Harvey Weinstein gave the couple the green light to produce the script. This time, however, the writing duo would be rounded out by a much-needed third member, one Philippa Boyens, who was recommended to join the team by Steven Sinclair. Though this would be her first time writing for the screen, she proved to be more than qualified, having read the Lord of the Rings trilogy over 7 times. Writing continued non-stop from pre-production all the way till the end of shooting, with some scenes being changed after each shooting day. Though, after their experiences on Meet the Feebles, rewrites posed little challenge to Jackson and Walsh. Due to its large projected budget of $75 million, finding potential financiers proved to be the biggest hurdle they had to overcome to bear the One Ring. Weinstein suggested compressing the trilogy into one movie to maintain a smaller budget, but Walsh and Jackson had too much respect for Tolkien's work to reduce it to a single film. Weinstein threatened to outsource the project to another director until Jackson's agent proposed that they find another investor to finance the franchise as a 2-film project within 4 weeks. In that time, Jackson and his team had to create a 36-minute spec short to try and entice potential investors. This is when Jackson called in his connection to New Line Cinema founder Bob Shaye, whom he had met previously trying to adapt the sequel script for the 5th installment of A Nightmare on Elm Street. To their surprise, Shaye expressed confusion about adapting it into 2 films, instead proposing that it should be a trilogy. By some miracle, New Line agreed to go ahead with The Lord of the Rings as a 3-part series, each released a year apart, with Jackson and crew at the helm. The tight pre-production schedule demanded that scripting, casting, location hunting, and effects work for all 3 films all had to be done simultaneously. Principal photography for the 3 movies demanded that they shoot for nearly 400 days non-stop.
We had a cast of actors and a wonderful crew who committed to 3 movies, to 18 months of work, and in the case of some of the crew members, 6 or 7 years of work. And that is something that, doesn't happen in the film industry, hardly ever.
He's marrying my sister.
Which required a certain level of madness, a trait which Jackson certainly qualified for. He now found himself stepping into Middle-earth, tasked with adapting the greatest fantasy saga of all time. In many ways, the daunting journey of Frodo and the Fellowship draws parallels to Jackson and crew's own filmmaking odyssey. A traveling party working together to overcome insurmountable odds, combining the culmination of all their efforts to reach a lofty goal most would think to be impossible. Though being underestimated was at this point nothing new to Jackson, the skills he learned from his previous film experiences, such as his ability to multitask, work with short deadlines, and quickly adapt on the fly, as well as his love for storytelling and special effects, perfectly prepared him for the role. In addition to this, his portly figure, easygoing nature, and habit of walking around barefoot painted him as the perfect caricature of a laid-back hobbit. Jackson's stubborn conviction to shoot in his home country also proved to be serendipitous, as the picturesque landscape of New Zealand provided the perfect backdrop to breathe life into Middle-earth. While Jackson had become accustomed to shooting on a controlled set, he became adamant about filming on location, exploring every nook and cranny of his home country's sprawling vistas, from the rolling hills of Waikato and Maramara to the idyllic peaks and valleys of Queenstown, even constructing relocation sets for Edoras, Minas Tirith, and Hobbiton.
I know I'm a Kiwi, but I have to say I cannot imagine making these films anywhere but this country.
For a feature that would usually take thousands of people and multiple effects companies, Jackson and the Weta crew took on all the work themselves, dedicated to painting the films with a singular, Tolkien-esque brushstroke, imbuing a strong spirit of historical realism and faithfulness to the author's original work.
The feeling that you used to have when you were standing surrounded by all this armour was that it felt as though it had been discovered on an archaeological dig. It had that sort of realism about it.
The greatest benefit for Weta Workshop having taken on the 5 departments that we did was that this singular Tolkien-esque brushstroke could be applied across as much of the workshop as possible.
According to Weta founder Richard Taylor, The Lord of the Rings required a youthful innocence. It required a level of sensitivity, something in the New Zealand psyche still.
This guy happily sort of linking little bits of chain mail together. I think he said with my armor that he'd linked 80,000 pieces of chain mail together.
I would not have traded this experience for the world. It has been the most amazing time of my life.
Thousands of maquettes were made to help bring the denizens of Middle-earth to life, which were then scanned to make a digital model using technology that was, at the time, used in meat processing plants. The team was adamant about using practical effects to breathe real, tangible life to Tolkien's world. To achieve this, Weta enlisted actual blacksmiths, sculptors, jewelers, and leatherworkers, setting up an artisan village plucked straight from Middle-earth. The Weta team wasn't limited to just crafting arms and armor, but were also responsible for making thousands of foam hobbit feet, elf ears, and prosthetic noses.
The foam latex ovens ran 365 days a year for 3.5 years to manufacture the massive amount of appliances out of 3 huge ovens.
It was amazing how much foam latex we used. I could never have visualised that quantity.
All this was done to maintain a spirit of earnestness and authenticity, making sure that every design and detail told a story. To that effect, Jackson also brought on board artists John Howe and Alan Lee, who had done the original illustrations for Tolkien's novels, as concept designers for the film. They even flew out to New Zealand to take inspiration from the local landscape, spending days at Waikato to bring the image of the Shire into reality. Jackson was determined to cast unknown talents to keep the focus on the world and story, which also jump-started the careers of main cast members like Orlando Bloom and Viggo Mortensen. Aside from the main cast, the film required hundreds, if not thousands of extras, literally uniting all of New Zealand and Tolkien fans around the world through the film. The need for stand-ins for the epic battle scenes was so great that the casting office had put up a sign on their wall that read, "If you're breathing, you're hired."
Kieran, I hear they're gonna set you on fire. How do you feel about that?
If it happens, I'll be really happy to do it.
For the cast and crew, a real fellowship was forged in the trials of making the film, forming a special bond that has lasted long after the cameras have stopped rolling. Elijah Wood has said the following about his time working on the trilogy. "There wasn't anything Hollywood about the experience. It felt like a massive independent film. I think the atmosphere really allowed us to be more free with what we were doing. I don't think we'd have been able to contribute as much passion or feed it with as much of the journey that we were taking as people because it wouldn't have been the same. This is a very special kind of project." Peter Jackson echoed the sentiment, stating, "It's not just a solitary exercise. It must be similar to what it's like fighting a war with a platoon of guys around you. We worked together for this long period of time, and we all got through it because we loved what we were making." From the release of the first movie, The Lord of the Rings made box office history, making $66 million on its opening weekend, more than double Jackson's entire American box office revenue from the past 12 years. The Fellowship of the Ring ranked as the 8th highest grossing movie of 2001, only 12 days after its release, and by the end of 2002, it became the 7th most successful film of all time. Jackson and crew continued to make history when the third installment, Return of the King, won a record-setting 17 awards at the Oscars, where Jackson dedicated the win to Fran and their 2 children, who knew nothing in their lives other than Dad being on this film. Despite having left his mark on cinematic history, Jackson remains the same filmmaker he always has been. The fingerprints of his love for fantastical creatures and all things disgusting can still be found if one knows where to look. While his imagination has spanned across different stories and genres, his pure childlike wonder for the magic of movie making will always remain a clear constant as he lives out his wildest fantasies every day he walks on set. Peter Jackson stands out as a rare breed of filmmaker who not only shares his visions of worlds unimaginable, but takes the journey there alongside us. One hobbit-sized step at a time.